Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And also by the generous support of listeners like you who choose to support us at Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the cyclist was solitary, the bachelor was noble, and the resident was patient, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? On which 3 continents did Watson have experience of women? When did 221B Baker Street first get telephone service? And why does Holmes prefer telegrams over writing?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 302. It happened at midnight. Well, hello there, and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, are we recording this close enough to midnight for your taste?
Oh, no. We have to hit pause, and let's come back in a few hours.
Perfect. Okay, we're back. I'm so glad we took that break.
Boy, I'm tired.
It gave me a chance to get a few cocktails in me, so this should be a really good conversation. Today we're going to be talking about things that happened after midnight or round about midnight in the Sherlock Holmes stories. And you'll see after we get done with it, well, you'll be able to draw your own conclusions, but I think you'll see a pattern emerging here. If you'd like the show notes for this episode, including any links to episodes, books, or other materials that we talk about, just find them at ihose.co/trifles302. All lowercase, ihose.co/trifles302, or we'll have a link to that in the podcast player that you happen to be listening to us on right now. And, here's something worth noting. We're available across all major podcasting platforms, including Apple Podcasts, but also on Spotify. And you know what you can do for us on Spotify if you happen to be listening to us there? Simply pop open the app and give us a rating. It's one click. All you have to do is click however many stars you think we're worth, and we know which end of the spectrum we'd encourage you to kind of lean on. But all you have to do is give us a quick rating right there in Spotify. And of course, if you'd like to listen to us on the smart speaker of your choice, just ask your speaker to play Sherlock Holmes Trifles. But it gets pretty late around these parts, and midnight seems like a great time to enjoy detective stories. The sun has been down for a while, and it is still hours to go before we see it again at dawn. And strange things seem to happen in the world of literature in midnight. It just seems to be kind of a witching hour of sorts.
But midnight, it is a strange hour just in the lives of people, particularly in a more agrarian society. People had sleeping schedules that meant they were awake in the middle of the night, basically, before big illumination, gas lamps and so on. People would go to bed, some of them, particularly in agrarian communities, pretty early, but then they would sort of wake up in the middle of the night. And then, because of superstition, particularly when you began to count the hours and tick down towards midnight, became a time when some people thought, that the line between life and death was thinnest, and that at midnight spirits and ghosts could travel between the two worlds, and and you were hidden. You were sort of hidden from the eyes of God and man, and you could do all kinds of things, and there you are.
Yeah. Well, I would imagine that there are certain people that thought they could get away with more in the middle of the night, unseen by society or by other individuals. And there was I remember in Lapham's Quarterly, there was a chart they had there called Midnight Mischief, Sleepy Decisions to Rethink at First Light. And they go through different time periods and different geographic locales. For example, 1775 in Massachusetts, as night falls, hired to warn revolutionary leaders in the suburbs of Boston of a rumored impending British raid, silversmith Paul Revere borrows a horse and sneaks out of the occupied city around 11 at night. And then, as day breaks, arriving in Lexington shortly after midnight, Revere successfully alerts John Adams and John Hancock. He attempts to continue on to the neighboring town of Concord after stopping for a drink with a fellow messenger, but is detained by a British sergeant who confiscates his horse.
Oh.
I know. I wonder how that worked out.
Yeah, whatever happened to him anyway?
And then here's an interesting one from Athens. As night falls, the night before a controversial invasion of Sicily is set to begin, nearly all of the city's many herms, stone pillars with carved heads and erect phalluses dedicated to the god of Hermes, are castrated while Athenians sleep. And as day breaks, a blow struck against the Herms, writes classicist Robin Osborne, was a blow struck against democracy. Suspicion falls on Alcibiades, a joint commander for the Sicilian expedition, but he avoids trial by defecting to Sparta. Yeah, you wonder if that's one of those pranks that was hilarious the night before, and in the calm rationale of daytime, it doesn't look quite as good. Well, why don't we turn to the Sherlock Holmes canon and put our minds to things that happened on or about midnight, or perhaps after midnight, that, are particularly telling. There's, a good 24 or so, maybe 10 or, not 10, 20, 22 items that we kind of pulled out here. I don't think we have to go through all of them, but where would you like to begin, my friend?
Oh, it doesn't, you could just sort of put a pin anywhere and find something in the Sherlock Holmes canon that involves midnight. You particularly, I would start really in two places, maybe the Retired Colorman and then maybe the Golden Pince-Nez.
Oh, good.
Just because it's those are interesting bookmarks. But in Retired Colorman, the so-called client returns from the theater around midnight, and this again is a time when there's no radio and no television and no automobile. So if you're going to the theater, the theater will, start and end, and then maybe you'll get a little bite to eat and then go to a train, and then the train will take you home, and then you need a cart to go to your house, and before you know it, it's midnight. And of course, he says he found the place plundered with the door and window open. But the other side of that is Golden Pince-Nez in Baker Street, where Stanley Hopkins famously calls on Holmes and Watson at midnight. And Holmes says, this is a time when all virtuous folk have been long in bed. So Watson has to open the door himself. He goes down, good old Watson goes downstairs to let Hopkins in. And that's it. Midnight was always kind of an inconvenient time. But if you're a detective, I imagine, you're clocking many of your working hours at midnight.
Sure, and it could be working hours, bent over a microscope or a chemistry table. It could be out in the street, gathering information from individuals, maybe trailing someone, maybe observing what the environs looked like at a time a particular crime was committed. There's a lot to do in the middle of the night if you are a busy detective. But as you say, Bert, it's not a time, or I guess as Conan Doyle said, not a time when respectable people might be out. And I have a book, it's called The Anti-Society, An Account of the Victorian Underworld by Kello Chesney. And again, we'll have a link to this in the show notes. This is from 1970, and it looks at various activities of the underground Victorian world. And by the way, by underground, I don't mean the subway. I mean the other side of society. And one of the chapters is all about prostitution and how women began gathering in the afternoons, but it wasn't until the outdoor theater lights went up that they really began to congregate. Because, of course, at that point, there would be people out and about going to the theater. And in one part here, and I'm just looking, he says, at none of these night haunts, smart, low, native, or exotic, could one expect to see a respectable woman. And that kind of backs up what Conan Doyle or Watson said there, that respectable people are asleep at this hour.
Well, that's true. And respectable women, are not unaccompanied in and wandering around England. But the other thing, too, is one of the characteristics that we occasionally talk about when we talk about Sherlock Holmes is his focus on solving problems and his strange patterns, his bursts of energy, his reluctance to waste energy by eating. There are times, for example, in the Red-Headed League when he says, this is quite a three-pipe problem, and I beg you, not to disturb me, for 50 minutes or whatever it is. But boy, if you have that sort of constitution and you're working on a challenging problem and trying to understand what's going on and reviewing the facts, what better time to do that than midnight, when there's no distractions, no noises from the street, when all is quiet, and you can just concentrate.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think a great example of, taking action that would move a case forward was in Charles Augustus Milverton. Of course, remember that Holmes and Watson had tried every angle of getting a hold of the papers that I think were threatening Lady Eva Blackwell's future, and had been unable to come to an agreement with Milverton or, exactly determine what they might be able to do. So, of course, Holmes became engaged literally and figuratively, both as a plumber and as a fiancé in Milverton's household. And he did this to determine where he might find those papers. Of course, there was a large green safe in Milverton's study where he kept them. And so the idea was he and Watson would have to burgle Milverton's safe, which meant they would have to secret themselves inside the house and make good their escape. And when would they do that? Well, it would be at night, of course, when the servants are asleep, but Milverton is out, etc. And Holmes and Watson are preparing, and Watson says that he had some black silk that he could make a couple of masks. Holmes said, I can see you have a strong natural turn for this sort of thing. Very good. Do you make the masks? We shall have some cold supper before we start. It's now 9:30. At 11, we shall drive as far as Church Row. It's a quarter of an hour's walk from there to Appledore Towers. We shall be at work before midnight. Milverton's a heavy sleeper and retires punctually at 10:30. With any luck, we should be back here by 2 with the Lady Eva's letters in my pocket. Holmes and I put on our dress clothes so that we might appear to be 2 theater goers homeward bound. And there it is, the perfect disguise. Evening clothes, looking as if they were out at the theater, coming home after midnight.
Yeah, don't pay any attention to those tennis shoes.
You think he had Keds or maybe Chuck Taylors? Or what do you think he was wearing? I'm trying to picture it.
I don't know. I don't know what a Victorian rubber-soled tennis shoe looked like, except, of course, the rubber sole, is pretty clear.
It would be so great if somebody made like a meme of a Sidney Paget portrait of Holmes and Watson breaking into Mulverton's house with the Nike swoosh that says, "Just do it."
I wonder what, I don't remember what they did in the Jeremy Brett series or other dramatizations of Milverton that were authentic and related to the story as opposed to the Benedict Cumberbatch approach. But I don't remember if we ever saw, David Burke or Edward Hardwick with with anything that looked like that we would think looked like a tennis shoe.
Yeah. I don't think so. I mean, I could only imagine him just kind of bounding onto the set with his racket and saying, "Tennis, anyone?" Well, why don't we take this well-deserved break, and when we come back, we'll spend some more time after midnight. The Baker Street Journal was first published in 1946, and its old series extended through 1949. It picked up again in 1951 and has been publishing ceaselessly every quarter since then. Every issue of the BSJ is packed with top-notch papers that reflect the sensibilities of Sherlockians from throughout the world. They might be scholarly in nature, giving us details on an aspect of Victorian life that maybe we weren't aware of. They might be tongue-in-cheek, that approach to the game where we wink at each other as we acknowledge Dr. Watson as the true author of the stories and try to figure out some inconsistency. Or they might be something that we never thought was related to Sherlock Holmes, and the author brings it all together for us. Whatever the approach, they're all represented in the Baker Street Journal. Plenty of varying opinions and researches on the world of Sherlock Holmes. Make sure you get on the subscription list to get your copy of the Baker Street Journal delivered to your mailbox every quarter by going to BakerStreetIrregulars.com today. All right, we're back, and I don't know if you're yawning yet, Bert. I'm getting a little sleepy. God knows our listeners are. But there's a handful of stories where some of the action takes place at midnight, and I thought we might tie those together a little bit. And let's do this chronologically if we can, starting with the engineer's thumb. You remember this is one of those. Well, I don't remember if it was a kidnapping case or not. He went out to Iceford, but he didn't know exactly where it was. Is that right? If I think about it.
Well, I don't remember Iceford, but basically what happens to Hatherley is his client insists on secrecy.
Right.
And so one thing or another, he winds up arriving there at midnight. And
yeah, and he was concerned because there was no train back. He could get the train to Iceford Station, and the colonel said our little place is out in the country, but there's no chance of a train back. I should be compelled to stop for the night. And he says, well, we could give you a shakedown. So, well, that's very awkward. Couldn't I come at a more convenient hour, right? Sure. And this would, in any normal person's experience, this should have raised a red flag. Being required as an engineer to go to your client's house at midnight instead of a regular business hours. But he did go off, and he said the fee was at least tenfold what I should have asked that I set my price upon my own services. So, once again, that canonical trope of paying more for services than one might otherwise should have also kind of tripped up our hero here too.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Now, you mentioned stepping through this chronologically, so we're at the engineer's thumb, but we don't want to miss Irene Adler in Scandal in Bohemia.
Oh, sure.
Who does something fairly unusual, at least in the communications dealt with in the world of Sherlock Holmes. Irene may write the only letter or Well, of course, a telegram would be time-stamped, but she may write the only letter in the canon that is actually timed at midnight, because my memory of that is that her note, as Holmes is looking at it, is like at the top of the note paper, she's written something like, Tuesday midnight.
Right. It was the night before at midnight. Now, what do you think the significance of her putting the date on the note was?
You mean the time?
The time, yeah. What do you think? What do you think the significance of her time stamping it was?
I have no idea. I mean, I can't.
I've got a theory.
It's clearly communicating to the reader that she's hustling out. But what's your theory?
I think that's exactly one of them. That this was all done in a great hurry. But remember, the night before, Holmes and Watson had arrived home and had been greeted by a passerby on the sidewalk who said, "Good night, Mr. Sherlock Holmes." Now, we didn't know for certain at that point if it was Irene Adler. She, of course, does make it clear in her note the next day, but I think the timestamp is meant to indicate that she was kind of wrapping things up in a hurry to let him know that she was onto him, and that she was, putting all of these things into play in a rather quick and workmanlike manner.
Well, that really would have been obvious. I mean, when he turns up, the next morning and finds her gone. But in any case, in that note, we find out that she leaves Baker Street, apparently goes right off to Godfrey Norton. They put their plans together, such as they were, and they're on the road.
Yeah. And so the next one, at least in publication order, that I thought might be interesting, is Silver Blaze. Holmes says, "Before deciding that question, I grasped the significance of the silence of the dog. For one true inference invariably suggests others. The Simpson incident had shown me that a dog was kept in the stables, and yet, though someone had been in and fetched out a horse, he had not barked enough to arouse the two lads in the loft. Obviously, the midnight visitor was someone whom the dog knew well." So Straker going out at midnight or after midnight under cover of darkness and secrecy to abscond with the horse.
Yes.
Similarly, we had Brunton in the Musgrave Ritual, who waited until after midnight. Holmes said, "And now how was I to proceed to reconstruct this midnight drama?" It was Brunton going out to do a little treasure hunting after he had been discovered, I think the evening or week before, in the library at about 2 a.m. with the Musgrave Ritual in hand.
It's interesting, too. There's another case where the focus on midnight and the timing of events delays action, maybe create suspense, but has always seemed to me to be just annoying for no purpose. There's this point in the activity of the case of Lady Frances Carfax where this is a case that most chronologists date around 1902. So it's not in the 1880s or 1890s. So Holmes now has been in practice for many more years, and one can presume that he's become more accustomed to procedure. And the reason I say that is what's going on is they're waiting for a warrant, but they can't get the warrant until the next day.
Right.
And so they're sort of cooling their heels, while this lady's life hangs in the balance. And near midnight, it says in the case, their friend the sergeant calls to say, I've seen flickering lights in the house. Now, we don't know what that means, really. I mean, did he show up? Did he put in an appearance where they were, or did he call them on the telephone? Because at that point,
Right.
you would find telephones popping up in the cases of Sherlock Holmes. But the idea that they're just sort of, somebody puts in an appearance around midnight and says, "Come on, Mr. Holmes, I see lights there." Okay, great. Yeah, we got to wait until 9 a.m. Watson, let's have a little breakfast and then let's get the warrant at 9 a.m.
Yeah. And I remember kind of a similar drama being played out in the Granada production of The Greek Interpreter as they were waiting for the warrant. Of course, Mycroft was involved then, and it seemed everything had to be done above board. And, of course, it was too late by the time they reached Paul Cratides. But in The Greek Interpreter, interestingly enough, this was something that Latimer didn't get out to the Myrtles to meet Paul Cratides until after midnight. In The Empty House, it was as midnight approached and the street gradually cleared, and they paced up and down in the room in agitation, and finally saw the would-be assassin of Sherlock Holmes making his appearance in The Empty House. In the Priory School, it was after midnight that poor little Arthur, Lord Salter, was kidnapped. This again would have been a meeting that would have been arranged in the fake letter sent to him by who he thought was his mother. The meeting would be after midnight, after all the children and ostensibly all of the administrators were asleep, but God bless the German master, Herr Heidegger, who was still awake grading papers and saw young Arthur scampering across the garden there.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it comes up again and again in the cases of Sherlock Holmes, where in Shaska Mold plays Holmes and Watson leaves Sir Robert, near midnight. In The Veiled Lodger, the assault from the escaped lion and the death of Rhonda, occurs near midnight. In The Creeping Man, where they take up their positions to watch Presbury, near midnight. It would not have, in the Red Circle, this lodger has rented rooms, and the people who've rented the rooms hear him, they think it's him anyway, come up the stair after midnight. None of that would have been as effective, for example, if they would have said to Holmes, "Oh, yes, Mr. Holmes, we heard the lodger return around 4:30. I know it was 4:30 because I was just having my tea. Of course,
He had to be back in time for tea.
That's right. We couldn't
Clearly
get
a
up.
British gentleman.
We couldn't get up quickly enough to go to the hall and see who was actually there. But it may have been 4. Carol, do you think it was 4:15 or 4? No. So there you are. But then the whole thing, perhaps is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
11 o'clock, gentlemen, on your feet.